Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Cooper Union Rose Auditorium and welcome to the Making Home with History lecture with Vaughn Belle and Germane Barnes. The lecture series is a collaboration between two institutions, the Cooper Union and the Cooper Hewitt. My name is Kayla Montes de Oca. I'm an associate professor here at the Cooper Union School of Architecture. And standing next to me is Alexandra Harkowski, curator of public programs at the Cooper Hewitt, who will be introducing our Making Home with History lecture and lecture series. But before we start, I wanted to give you a little context for the evening and very quickly introduce the collaboration. The Cooper Union was founded in 1859 by American industrialist Peter Cooper, based on the belief that education should be free to anyone who qualifies regardless of class, creed, race, or gender. The Cooper Hewitt was founded in 1897 by Sarah and Eleanor Hewitt, the granddaughters of Peter Cooper. Its name was originally the Cooper Union Museum of the Arts of Decoration and was located across the street in the foundation building of the Cooper Union until 1969. This free and accessible museum opened as a working laboratory for use by students and the general public. And then they moved to uptown to the Carnegie Mansion and became known as the Cooper Hewitt Museum of Decorative Arts and Design, Smithsonian Institution. So just a bit of history. And now Alexandra to introduce the lecture series.
Thank you, Kayla. We always laugh that this is not the first Cooper Union, Cooper Hewitt kind of rendezvous. So we're excited to be here. It's almost like coming home. With the Making Home lecture series, of which this is the third, we wanted to feature the exhibition participants and pair them with designers, artists, professionals, and Cooper Union faculty and or alumni, or both in this case, to discuss the exhibition's exploration of home, its relation to data, justice, history, like tonight, and building. We want to thank everyone here at Cooper Union, including Ben Aranda, who is the co-organizer here and also a participant in the Making Home exhibition, Haley Eber, the acting dean, and Mauricio and Mike, who have helped with all the AV side of things tonight, which tonight is extra AV because we're bringing in Germane virtually. So thank you so much for all your help with that. If you haven't seen the show at the museum yet, I invite you all up. We're on 91st and 5th. There are 25 site-specific installations taking over the whole museum, exploring design's role in shaping the physical and emotional realities of home across the United States, U.S. territories, and tribal nations. If you'd like to follow along and join other upcoming programs, head to the museum's website, check out our calendar, and consider signing up for our newsletter. Our next and final Cooper plus Cooper program is actually a 2-day program on Indigenous architecture, building systems, environment, and food sovereignty. It's going to be a good one. And it's starting here at Cooper Union on Friday, April 25th, and then at the museum the next day, Saturday, April 26th. At that, I'm going to introduce our speakers tonight. First, we'll hear from Vaughn Belle, who is a multidisciplinary artist whose work focuses on the often forgotten colonial narratives embedded in the architecture and material culture of contemporary society. Vaughn will share a deeper look into her work and the installation titled "The House That Freedom's Built" in the Making Home Triennial exhibition. Germane Barnes is the principal of Studio Barnes and associate professor and director of the Master of Architecture graduate program at the University of Miami School of Architecture. Barnes' practice investigates the connection between architecture and identity, examining architecture's role and political agency through historical research and design speculation. For the exhibition, Germane made these incredible sound structures in collaboration with Ari, artist in residence in the Everglades, in a work called Ebb and Flow. Once Germane and Vaughn share more about their work and the exhibition commissions, Cooper Union professor and alumni who you just met, Kayla Montes de Oca, will join them in a discussion about the influence of Afro-diasporic social and historical narratives in their work. Briefly, Kayla is a design researcher and educator from Miami, Florida. Her research examines how policy and design shape communities over time, focusing on how individuals sustain tradition, build legacy, and navigate the power of place in collective memory and identity. Please join me in welcoming Vaughn first to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Well, actually, from the Virgin Islands, we usually say good night, but then people get confused. They're like, "You're saying goodbye?" No, we greet by saying good night. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to share with you a little bit more about my work and, of course, the project that I have for the Cooper Hewitt Show. I like to start off when I talk about my work showing this image because it helps to conceptualize a bit about where I live and where I'm from. This is our government house on Saint Croix, which would be the equivalent to your White House. And you will notice it has 3 flags, the US, the Danish flag, and the VI flag is in the middle. And although we have not been Danish for over 250 years, actually over 100 years, we were Danish for about 250 years, this image kind of exemplifies that we are caught between our colonial past and our colonial present, as we've been a colony of the US for just over 100 years. This is the island that I live on, Saint Croix. It was cut up into over 150 plantations, and you'll see here on this map that some of the main structures are identified here, which you can see in our landscape. It's the so-called Great House, which are the mansions where the planters would have lived, and also the sugar mills where enslaved people would have pushed sugarcane through rolling pins. And they are pretty much everywhere. We see them in our shopping centers. You can see sugar mills. We have schools in them, churches in them, neighborhoods in them. My own neighborhood where I live, there's one maybe just a 5-minute walk away. So this idea that the past is not really our reality. We literally live in the ruins of plantations. And so that has greatly impacted me as an artist and the kind of work that I do. This is an example of a work that I did in 2011, where I am reenacting Goldilocks and the Three Bears inside that same great house that I showed earlier. It's one of the few great houses that are public facing. It's currently a museum space. And I'm thinking a lot about how do I, we know that story about Goldilocks is about, it's about someone trespassing into someone else's space. And so it's kind of thinking about what do these structures mean to us as especially Black Virgin Islanders? What is it like to navigate these spaces? Presently, because these museum spaces are often places that you can't touch up the people's things. I mean, you can see them lying in the bed, things like that, but also the way that we connect to that past history as well. And then shortly around that time, I also purchased 2 abandoned structures in our historic town of Christiansted to turn into an artist studio. I didn't know anything about the history of these buildings. I bought them because they were super cheap. But shortly after, a historian offered to do research for me. And at that moment is when I learned about the history of these structures that I bought, that they were, the first registered owners were all the way from the early 1700s, that the first 3 owners were African-born women who had survived slavery, survived the Middle Passage, bought themselves out of slavery, and owned these properties in the mid-1700s, early 1800s. And I was shocked. It made me look at my property that I thought were like these little shacks that I bought totally differently. And I was also really like, I'm fairly educated. Why didn't I know this history? Why is this neighborhood so abandoned? And so I did a lot of the renovation work myself, and I started doing a lot of advocacy work for historic preservation of these properties and learning more about the narratives. I wanted to interview people who'd lived in this neighborhood when it was still vibrant. Like, what was it like? Did you know about the history of this neighborhood? And it really just it change my life. It changed my practice. I started really becoming aware of the connection between narrative and space and materiality. For example, I would find these small pottery fragments outside of my building. The bigger one is from the Royal Copenhagen, which is a company that's about 260 years old. It's a European luxury brand of porcelain that was created, and here I'm finding this outside of my building. And I started thinking a lot about how there were these mini paintings, but also how they were these stories that were refusing to be buried. Like every time the rain would come, you would kind of find these fragments, they would resurface in the soil. And in Saint Croix, we actually have a name for these fragments. We call them Chanin. It's a hybrid word that means China and money. And it's called that because enslaved children used to round them to look like coins. So, it's like they were creating their own currency through play and their imagination. And I thought that was a beautiful metaphor to think about how could I use this to kind of comment on to use that same play and imagination to create something new, but also to kind of create a map. Like this work for me, I've done many types of versions of this work with my Chaney paintings, but for me, I was thinking a lot about how there was this register of the ruin, the register of the beauty, the fracture, but how in Caribbean identity, we kind of piece these fragmented identities together to create something new. And I would also find coral stone outside of my studio. And I noticed that they had these very sharp, they were manipulated, and of course wondering like, why is coral from the ocean just laying outside of my building? And I started going into the archives and reading about a Danish planter describing the process of enslaved Africans being sent out into low tide to cull the coral. And they used them primarily for two things. They were the foundation of all the colonial era buildings, and then they would also take the coral and burn them, and they would use it kind of like a mortar for the bricks that they would import from Denmark. And when I had been asked to think about a monument to thinking through the Danish colonial history when the 100-year centennial came about in terms of the transfer from Denmark to the United States, I thought a lot about how these, maybe, we think a lot about monuments as structures that have plinths that the things are on top. And I had been thinking a lot about how this actually was like a monument to the labor of the enslaved people who built these structures, but not just their labor, but like their spirit, their spirituality, their hand. And so this piece was kind of a mock-up. It was me thinking through this idea of how could I create a memorial to them by using these objects. Also thinking about how when we think a lot about the structures in the Virgin Islands, we call them Danish. And we often forget about this labor and the people and their spirit and their legacies that are also infused in these buildings. So this piece was a lot about trying to honor that. And I've also done a lot of other interventions into buildings. This was from an exhibition I did last year that it's a series of paintings that then have the wall painting, and then it interacts with the building as it's, in the horizon of the structure, or the horizon that you can see from the structure. And then this is also a sculpture that I had done in that same exhibition that was reimagining the first encounter story of the native, when the indigenous people, or when I should say Columbus, came to Saint Croix. In the archival records, there's this fascinating story where he thinks that he's rescuing Taino people from the Caribs, and the Caribs fight back. And what's very interesting about that story in the records is that as he's trying to take some people onto the ship, he overturns one of their canoes, and then they are able to kind of swim and shoot arrows in the water at the same time. And it's the first documented violent encounter between Europeans and indigenous people in the Americas where Europeans were killed. And that happened on the island of Saint Croix. It's a fairly well-known story, but what I was interested in doing in this piece was how could I create almost another kind of memorial to that piece, and also thinking about how the structure of the building that I was exhibiting and could demonstrate that or support that. And as I mentioned, because I had been doing a lot of the work from my studio, it really got me thinking a lot about I started noticing all the architectural details in our two historic towns, and this is from the town of Frederiksted. And Frederiksted looks different from Christiansted because of one major historical event. Our towns are called twin towns. They literally have the same name streets: King Street, Queen Street, Market Street, etc. But Frederiksted looks different because of a labor revolt we call it the Firebahn, and we call it that because they use fire as their main weapon to burn down over 50 of the plantations and much of this town. And then when the town was being rebuilt, it was being rebuilt during a time where this Victorian architecture, the gingerbread fretwork, was very popular. And I found that so interesting, how the history of resistance was literally inside the architecture of the town. And I wanted to, as an artist, figure out how could I create a visuality of resistance that maybe imitated or registered that tool, like how every major rebellion in the Caribbean was fought by basically fire and the same cutlass or cane bill that they had to, their workers' tool. So I developed this technique in my practice I call cuts and burns, where I'm taking a woodworker's tool that can burn, and I'm using it kind of incorrectly by pumping it up, but I'm actually cutting and burning at the same time into paper. So what you're looking at is, hundreds and thousands of small cuts and burns. And sometimes I have them as ledgers, as curtains. And this work is the precursor to the work that I have at the Smithsonian. It's thinking about those same patterns in the buildings of the town in Frederiksted, and also in the same way that my studio, the same kind of structure that my artist studio is, which is in a neighborhood. One of the things that I learned was not just about the history of the owners, but that the neighborhood of that, where my studio was called Freegut. It actually had a previous name that is very derogatory, that begins with an N. But it was called Freegut because that's where all the people who found their way out of slavery during that time were relegated to live by law. But what I found very interesting when I did a lot of the research is that they were free, but they couldn't marry whites. The women couldn't wear certain clothes like lace or chintz. The men had to, as a condition of maintaining their freedom, they had to hunt runaway slaves. They couldn't leave their house after 10. They couldn't gather in public. Like, they had a lot of restrictions upon them. And so what I understood was that then their house would have been their only real free space. And it made me see all the architectural details inside the house totally different, like how that they were like these really precious, precarious, but also spaces of home, to think about the concepts of the exhibition, but that it was precarious. And so I created these small sculptures that had no nails, no glue, that they're pieced together with these metal pins, and the roof is pieced together with its own weight. And so there was a fragility, and I also wanted that they had no visible entrance or exit, really almost like so that you would have this magical wondering, like, how do you enter this space? And like, who is this space for? And that there's a clear, like, there's an insider, outsider. And from the moment I made the work, I always dreamed of doing it bigger. And I started partnering with this organization in Saint Croix called Chance. And we started preparing for that possibility. So we'd written a grant, and we started a project where we were working with young people to, these kind of building art trades are kind of forgotten. There are not a lot of people who know how to do that work anymore. So we were training them in how to make these gingerbread fretwork designs, but also how to make their own. What I found so interesting when we would take them around walks in the town is, some of them were a little like, why do we have to preserve this European stuff? That was their attitude. And, I always encourage them to think that, well, even though maybe some of these patterns are European, like people are putting their own aesthetic desires and inclinations in them. Like, so they're not necessarily carbon copies. And what I found so interesting, of course, is when they were then coming up with their own designs, they were putting ankhs in it. They were doing all kinds of other designs as well. And some of those designs are actually what I use in the piece that I have in the Smithsonian. And then, of course, a few years ago, the Smithsonian came knocking and asked me to consider doing a larger version of this work, which was a true dream come true. And I think the challenge for me was, the piece that I did was smaller. It was not going to have to sustain snow, weather, anything like that. So there's a beautiful marrying of design and my artistic vision here, where the team that I worked with, Powerhouse Arts, beautifully were able to come up with a framing that could still kind of be hidden, so that the piece still felt like light and airy and a little magical and a little like, how does that get built? So I really look forward to more conversation about the work and also to be in conversation with Germane and Kayla. So thank you.
Oh, this is really trippy. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Awesome. First, I want to thank you, give a huge thank you to the Cooper Hewitt for allowing me to do this virtually. I'm having a few health issues at the moment, so I wasn't able to get on the plane and come be there in person. But trust me, I would much prefer to be there in conversation in person with the lovely Lavon and Kayla. Trust me, it would have been incredible and far more enjoyable than you all seeing my face on the screen. But we're going to make do, and we're going to talk about a couple projects. And those projects are based off of the theme Making Home. So 3 of them are ones I completed before, with the 4th being the actual work that's in the show. So we'll get started now. So as the lovely Alexandra mentioned earlier, I'm Germane Barnes of Studio Barnes. We're based in Miami, Florida. And I love to always talk about the way we start our projects, which I use this term griot, which is a West African term, which is essentially the keeper of stories. So when I think of making home, I think about what stories are kept, what narratives, what histories do I associate with home? And in my case, that's my grandmother. She passed recently, but she was the keeper of our home. And she was also the one that made sure that no matter where we were, it felt like home. And this is an exhibition that we did for her in Miami, Florida at Oolite Arts. And that exhibition is called Rosie's Fair. And the purpose of this exhibition is that when my grandmother grew up in the South in Arkansas, the people there called her Rosie Fair, F-A-I-R, in that she's an attractive woman. So I took that term fair and changed it to F-A-R-E to talk about what it means to do work and what is the domestic labor that's attached to gender and perhaps gender violence that happens in these spaces. So what you're looking at is an actual room, which is a kitchen, but how do we manipulate this space to make it many other things? Because when you happen to be a person of color from a certain background, you have to be clever with the spaces you have, and they serve multiple uses. So in this case, the idea is that the kitchen also becomes a hair salon, because when necessary, you do hair in the kitchen bowl. So we took some bold patterns, we recreated the entire structure, and then showed what it could be like if we rebuilt the entire kitchen around this idea. But then we made sure not to complete the other side of the actual room itself, so that while it looks like it's the framing of an unfinished room, what it really references metaphorically is the fact that for some people, the domestic labor that was done in these spaces was not always acknowledged, not always celebrated. And unfortunately, for some people, it became a source of extreme pain. So think of this side of the project more so as a jail than it is as an actual unfinished wall. So now I'll talk about a project called Rock Roll. And the reason why this project is in here, because I think in conversation with Vaughn, it's important to talk about how rooted in Miami is this idea of the Caribbean diaspora. I myself am not Caribbean, but you can't live in Miami and not understand what it means to be a part of the culture. So we created these movable structures. You sit within them, they rock back and forth, and they're supposed to reference the regalia that one sees at Carnival. And in addition, there's this huge disco ball that we put in the center of downtown Miami. So it would be maybe a 24-hour party, because one of the most amazing things about Carnival is the music. So you're seeing these structures which really reference what it means to wear the colorful patterns. And here's a short little video to kind of give you an idea of what that means when you see all the various flags and you see the color palettes. Like, I think this is just an amazing thing for people who live in the city and want that city to feel like home. And the last portion is these hanging elements. And the hanging elements are to reference the steel drums that people find when they're actually there listening to the music in real time. This project here is a Spectrum of Blackness. This was at MoMA. This was a part of the Reconstruction show. And I wanted to show this because this project was really important from a sense of home, in that the idea behind this project is, what does the porch mean? What does the kitchen mean? And then what does water mean to a person? And understanding the multiplicities and the various understandings of cultural diversity that happens in Miami, where you might find someone that's Dominican or Panamanian or Jamaican or from Saint Croix. But one of the things that unite them oftentimes is what they cook with. So we did all of these various interviews with various ethnic groups and talked to them about things they cook with, and created this sort of exploded spice wall. So think maybe an exploded axonometric that you might draw in your architecture class or something, but here's a real life version of it as a sculpture. And then we made these 12 unique collages that also talk about the same thing, but also understanding what it means from the home. So you'll see in the middle, a young girl getting her hair done. And you see this happens in the kitchen. You see the mountains for Jamaica. You see in the bottom right-hand corner, this idea of labor on Miami Beach, where unfortunately, if you were not a white person, you had to keep with you a racial identification card in order to even have access to Miami Beach. So I wanted to continue to show and talk about these various issues, but also get people to understand that that there's a wide spectrum of what it means to carry identity in many cities. And so if you look at it from this side, you'll see the full exploded spice wall as it pulls away from each of the design elements. And so now the last project is the actual contribution to the Making Home exhibition at the Cooper Hewitt. So Artists in Residence in the Everglades is this amazing nonprofit organization that they pick 12 artists over the course of 12 months, and each artist stays in the Everglades for a full month. So as someone that did this fellowship, one of the things you learn about the Everglades is its slowness, and that you really have to be able to live with your thoughts and be able to understand quiet As someone that's from a big city, I had never seen stars until I actually was out there in the middle of nowhere. But I think the incredible thing is understanding the legacy of people that have made their way through the Everglades. So my contribution to the actual show are these sound stations, and the sound stations reference the actual straw structures that were built by the Gullah Geechee when they were actually leaving from southeast of the U.S. when they first came through the transatlantic slave trade all the way down into the South and into Florida and into swampland. So these are some of the early sketches of talking about how the weaving might occur, where the speaker might happen, what's ornament and what's not. And so those sketches became this sound structure, where you can see again this idea of the weaving that happens around the structure. Some are ornament, some are there for support and structure. And then you see it there within the larger room that was curated by Airy for ebb and flow. The actual title of these little pieces is Speaker Box with 10 X's. And then you see the actual headphones that are there adorned to the front of the actual structure itself. And so this is the last image, so we can get to this wonderful conversation. And I wanted to have this here because I think when I envision making home, for me, a lot of times, as someone that doesn't have a rooted location, I move quite often. For me, home is actually where my family is. So as long as my family is there, it always feels like home. Thank you.
Testing. Testing. Can everyone? Germane, can you hear us? Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you all for sticking around for the second half of the conversation and beautiful work from both Vaughn and Germane. So this evening's conversation focuses on making home and history through the lens of the Afro-diasporic urban architectures and cultural heritage. So what it brings Vaughn and Germane together is an engagement with how communities preserve, transform, and reimagine space in response to legacies. So this idea leads us to how we both engage with the built environment as more than just a form, as a means of story, as a form, but as a means of storytelling and intervention. So with all your work showing how colonial architecture isn't just imposed, but it's embedded in place. It also has cited resistance and cultural memory. During your project, like Spectrums of Blackness, explore Black identity and making, but also this interesting reversal of geographical privilege with, South Beach only being available for race. And both of your work suggest that architecture is not neutral, and history is something that we carry. It's also shape, reframe, and even subvert. So I also think there's a current theme of reimagining. So can you talk a bit more about how you each approach beyond identifying these elements in architecture towards constructing new ways of understanding space and identity? And how does this process of reimagining show up in your work and how you think about your creative practice?
Germane, do you want to go first or?
No, you got it. You can go first.
I think maybe I might first think about that question as to like more of a question like why? Because I think in my presentation I talked a lot about like how, but it's like why? Why do I feel the need to maybe even reimagine these spaces? And I feel like there's a lot of symbolic violence to live in a plantation. And so it is like a survival strategy. It's like how, Like, how did I end up on these little rocks in the Caribbean Sea? And it's part of this incredibly violent, but also powerfully resilient history. And it's so much shaped. It's like when you live in this material legacy of these, I think it's a way to also talk back to that history and reshape it. Um, and also to think about a lot of the silences that are in the fragments and the ruins and how to work with that. Like for me, there's a lot about the unknown that I think is a really powerful place to think about. Because I did talk a lot like, well, I know this about the history and I know this about the history and I can research this in the archives, but there's a lot that you don't know. And there's a lot that's been lost, but that's also a powerful space of imagination too. And I think that's part of the why. Like I feel like it's a place for me to create something, like to chart a new path, like another way of creating my own map of how to navigate a space like the Caribbean. So, how about you, Germane?
I think for me, it's about archiving. So much of my family's history and family similar to mine is oral history. And a lot of that oral history resides in very few people. And that becomes a very, very heavy task to keep that within them. So I like to envision alternative histories or existing histories and then archive those. And then those get archived through collage or through objects or through sculpture. And I like to believe that the things that we create at the studio not only are the keepers of stories, but also are the translators of stories. And our biggest goal is to always make sure that the people that are witnessing the work don't need an architecture degree to understand it. We find a lot of times that the things that we draw or do speak to a specific audience, whereas I like to believe that our audience is far broader and they have a different type of embedded knowledge. And that embedded knowledge may not be typical architecture jargon. It might be just common words that we use. And so we do our best to try to make sure that we represent that as opposed to talking to other architectural design professionals, if that makes sense.
I find it interesting because I that you said it's also an archiving practice, because I think for me, my work is very much like thinking through what it is to kind of create an alternative archive or a counter archive. But I'm curious, do you feel that you're responding to European colonial archives through the built architecture, like through the built heritage, or do you feel like you're or are you just creating something alternative to that? Or are you responding to that, like using it as something that you're pushing back against?
So the archives that we typically dive into are typically Black archives. So a lot of the Miami work is literally the Black archives in downtown Miami at the Historic Lyric Theater. But then the other projects that we do, we just have conversations with community elders because they themselves are archives. And I'm sure that there are some entanglements of colonialism that they have within their own lives, and they're sharing that with me. But to say that I speak directly to those types of archival systems, we don't actually go to those because there's enough books written about that stuff. Instead, I want to find out about your aunt or your uncle or your cousin that has an amazing story. To me, those are far more fruitful for our practice in the way that we do things.
Mm. And with both of you, I'm interested in how you challenge what is maybe worthy of preservation when you think about maybe tackling everyday objects for oral histories, and when you consider traditional archives and those archival gaps and starting to build your own archive. How do you go through the process of deciding, okay, what do I want to keep versus what I don't?
I think so. A lot of the projects that we start by writing. We do a lot of writing. Some of it's coherent, some of it's not. Some of it's disjointed. But to me, there's certain truths in text And as a part of that, we then can go back later and look at it and see if there's something that we can synthesize later, or if it's actually useful in the thing that we're designing. So when we're creating these sort of bodies of work or these bodies of archival knowledge, we have huge folders just filled with a lot of these things. And sometimes we use it, sometimes we don't. But I mean, there's obviously privacy issues with some individuals that give you things that are off the record and they don't want them to be shared. But there are also those that proudly want to talk about their stories and the stories of their communities. And I think both are equally as important and valuable. I just know that that's more ethnographic and anthropological than it is design and architecture. And that's most of the time why I jokingly tell people I'm an architectural anthropologist, more so than I say I'm a licensed architect.
I think for me, I lead with my curiosity, I think in the presentation, it's like, what are these objects I'm finding outside? Like, what do they mean? My curiosity is what leads a lot of what I decide to pursue. And I think it's important to also think about maybe how it's like I'm trying to find the right way to say it, but it's like how my body navigates through the space and how, yeah, it's a process of curiosity, but also like really trying to understand like how the body is navigating through the space and how the body can also be like a barometer and also a translator for the space and the histories and the objects.
Can we stay there for a second?
Yeah.
LaVaughn, I love what you said there. And the reason I say this is because as an educator, one of the things I ask my students is, do you move through space intentionally or clumsily? And they're always confused when they have to think about it. And then in the end, you typically find most of the male students say clumsily, and most of the non-male students say intentionally, because there's certain safety in how you move through space.
Can you say more about that? Like, what is it to move through space clumsily?
Not aware of your surroundings, the privilege of not thinking through, do you need to have on share my location with friends as you're going through the city, not worrying about when you get on an elevator or when you turn or you walk on campus when there are no lights on, not worrying about who gets in the car first, these sort of things that we take for granted as people that might move through clumsily versus those that have to move through with intentionality.
Yeah, I'm interested in that question and comfortability, but also the idea of like, what is home to you both? And you both have such personal relationships with place and movement, and your work is so centered around the idea of home. So, LaVaughn, you've spoken so powerfully about the fragments of the pottery, but also the fragments of Caribbean identity and how to sort of piece that back together and create anew. And Germane, your work often returns back to questions of home as both a physical but also cultural practice. So given your experiences with your work and this not so easily defined emotions around home, and what does it mean to feel maybe homesick for a place that lives in memory more than just reality? And how do you address that tension in the process of your work, specifically with you, LaVaughn, and the colonial influences in Saint Croix, and what that means for how you just maybe walk down the street and engage with your neighbor?
I think what Germane was saying about intentionality, like I think home is a series of choices. It's the painting of a wall. It's the placement of an object. It's choice. I mean, it's a collection of choices, And that's what I think is really interesting for me, the relationship between home and freedom, because that's also what a lot of people feel free is, like their ability to make a particular set of choices. And that can also be precarious. I mean, our choices can be limited or expansive depending on who we are and when we are. So, yeah, I think that's like when I think about my project, I think a lot about that. Like, even though it's a project that comes out of a particular history, I mean, we all are feeling the precarity of a certain set of choices, and that means that our sense of home is all threatened. Yeah.
Germane, do you have anything?
Yeah, I don't, as much as I try not to, I think I always find a way to sneak a little Chicago into all the work that we do. Um, and sometimes that's consciously, sometimes it's subconsciously. But I think so much of my identity and so much of my practice was shaped by being born and raised there that it's hard to detach it from the work, that I have to actively tell myself not to put it in the things that we're doing. And sometimes we're successful and sometimes we aren't. But I think as far as this idea of sort of homesickness, I think the ones that are more profound in their representation of the city are the ones that I probably was feeling a bit more homesick at the time.
Yeah. Maybe this is on a personal note, but how do you feel about moving from Chicago to Miami and teaching in Miami and doing a lot of your work and site specificity in Miami, as Miami is such a Caribbean place and there's so many Caribbean influences, and how does that Caribbean culture also maybe tie into your work as you talked about in the projects that you presented? I just want to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I am very nomadic. So it actually wasn't a direct beeline from Chicago to Miami.
Okay.
It was Chicago to Cape Town, South Africa, to Los Angeles, then to Miami. And the funny thing about living in Miami is that's the first place I'd ever lived where someone asked me, where am I from? To which I said, Chicago. And they're like, no, 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 like, where are you from? And I didn't quite understand they were trying to place my lineage and my ancestry. So I responded with the west side of Chicago. Like, I'm from the city. And they're like, no, 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 no. Like, where's your family from? And I was like, oh, my grandmother's from Arkansas on my mom's side, and on my dad's side is Mississippi. Because all I know is like that migration. But Miami is really what told me the various shades and spectrums and blurriness that's Blackness that I had never experienced living in Chicago at all. And it was extremely eye-opening and illuminating. And so much of that has influenced the work because I've been here now for 12 years in the city. And while I am not Caribbean, almost everybody I meet is Caribbean. And anywhere I go, people speak to me typically in Spanish first. And then after Spanish, people might speak to me in Creole. We don't get to English or me being American after about 3 or 4 guesses. And that's always interesting to me because it only happens in this city. And then when you teach students who also come from the same area, it's always fun to understand the various differences and commonalities. And that's why a lot of the work talks about that.
I think Miami is the only place where you can order takeout on the phone and they'll answer in Spanish. So it's a really interesting place to be. And LaVaughn, you've also jumped around a lot in terms of even living in Cuba also.
Yeah, but I think I've always lived on an island because I lived in Manhattan too. And I think it's interesting how people forget that New York is also a group of islands. When we think about island culture, we always think about something that's provincial or small. And I think we also forget that the Caribbean is really one of the first super cosmopolitan places. We've had every major civilization from Africa to Europe to the Middle East to Asia to the indigenous populations collide there. So I feel that, for me, home is also that. Like, home is also an intersection of lots of different cultures.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think before we maybe open it up to Q&A, since we are at the Cooper Union and this is a part of the School of Architecture, I do want to ask about your thoughts on architectural education and how you're both of your work expands representation while raising questions about how to share knowledge across generations. So I want to, for Germane at least, and maybe for Vaughn as well, on a broader note, how you think about architectural education and the way that you teach and how your work kind of influences how you approach teaching architecture to a younger generation.
I think this new crop of students are far more brave than when I was a student, which I find extremely exhilarating. They push back, they demand things, they don't tolerate nearly as much toxicity as I dealt with when I was a student about 20 years ago. So I think when I envision the future of architecture education, I see something that's far more empathetic because the students are demanding empathy. And I see something that is a lot more interdisciplinary because many people don't want to work in traditional practices. They don't want to go work in a typical corporate office. A lot of people have many interests. And I think all of these different things will only make the field better. That's just my own personal opinion. But I'm excited for it. And I encourage it as an educator.
Well, I don't teach architecture.
Yes.
I have been a teacher part of it, but I think, obviously my work intersects a lot with architecture. I think deeply about space and narratives in that. But when I did teach, I thought it was very important to also help my students begin to hone that kind of eye. I mean, very much, to me, it's kind of like drawing in space, but it is in another kind of way. And when you are teaching, for example, drawing, you start to just see things differently. So I think, as I mentioned, I don't teach architecture, but I could imagine that it is just a different way of seeing the environment that you're in. And it's not just about line and structure and columns, but like who and for what and why and when. It's a more expansive way of, I would think, or I would hope, a more expansive way of thinking about the structures that we're creating.
Yeah. There's a quality of slowness that is beneficial to when you think about how your body moves through space, as you were talking about, but also how you as a person is different from your classmate that is sitting right next to you and how they might approach a project and to be considerate about that as well. But thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation, and thank you for presenting your beautiful work. And
are we going to open up to anybody?
Yeah, we are. And I want to open it up to the audience if there are any questions.
Comments?
Comments, yes.
I can pass the microphone if anybody. Yeah. It's just
You all are making me miss Miami. We could use some palm trees and some light today in the snow outside. I have a really easy question. I'd like to know what you're both working on next. What's happening in 2025, 2026?
For me, the most immediate thing I'm working on is a new performance piece. I've been thinking a lot about walking as an artistic practice. I walked a lot during the pandemic, and it helped me to think through, as Germane mentioned, a different kind of intentionality in how I move through space and how I use my body to interact with the architecture and the histories of the town in Christiansted, which is where my studio is. So I've been thinking a lot about this new project and wells. Like we have these large public wells that kind of look like sci-fi time travel platforms. They're abandoned wells, so they're not used, but that's a project that I'll unveil in March. And I also have a public art commission in Miami. So hopefully we will be able to meet. And it's going to be at the headquarters of the Royal Caribbean. I'm actually going to be doing the same Chanin work that I've been doing, but translating that into a floor piece. So I'm looking forward to figuring out how we're going to do that. Yeah.
We have a few things that we're cooking in the kitchen at the moment, but I'll only talk about two. One of them is we were the recipients of the Miller Prize for Exhibit Columbus this year's cycle. So on Saturday, my team will be in Columbus, Indiana to talk about our proposal. Ben, you had that a few years ago. So we got it this year. So we'll finally be in your club.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And the other thing that is something we're doing in the future, which I'm super excited about, is we were selected by Blacks in Green, who is a nonprofit in Chicago, and they are the stewards of the historic Emmett and Mamie Till home on the south side of Chicago. So we'll be doing the exhibition design and work on the historic Emmett Till home back in Chicago.
That's great. Oh, another question. Let me come around. Hold on.
Hi, thanks for sharing this amazing work, and especially for the intersection of your two practices. I'm curious to know if you encounter or what your approaches might be to technologies. And I'm saying that in the plural because I'm not really specifically talking about electronic or current means of what we associate, but the idea of technology in an archetypical way. Tools, even if not necessarily physical. Although it would be interesting to know if you do encounter intersections between our current common understanding of technology and the other form that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. There's a part of my practice that I've been thinking a lot about decolonial strategies that exist in nature and thinking about nature. Like if we imagine and we understand in the Caribbean that people were rebelling and we had all these rebellions, could we also imagine that nature was doing it too? And that we could find registers of that. I mean, and that there's, for example, like I did a project in South Carolina last year in the rice plantations, that when I was researching all this super technical things about rice plantation culture and technology, I realized that there was always things that they had to develop in response to what nature was doing that thwarted the process of what they were doing to the land, which was very destructive. Whether it be the birds would like eat up all the seeds by afternoon, and then they would have to create this thing to deal with the birds. So it started making me think a lot about nature has also been rebelling. And so how could we imagine, for example, the swarm of termites or bees or the ways that they have aspects of them that look destructive, but that they're also regenerative. So I've been thinking a lot about that in my practice, those kinds of tools or technologies that exist in nature that we can, like hurricanes, I have a whole series that deals a lot with the storms and things like that. So yeah.
We do a lot of we do a lot of analog stuff, honestly. And I think that's because my foundation was analog. We have a lot of technological tools at our disposal, and we're not afraid to utilize them as a means to an end. But typically, most of our things start analog and honestly remain analog for a very long period of time before it actually before it gets made. Because most of the technology that comes into our practice is for means of fabrication and construction as opposed to ideation. I hope that answers the question.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think that's
all.
that
No
wraps up the Q&A. Is there a Zoom? Oh, yeah. Are there?
Can I say one thing real quick?
Yes.
Again, I just want to thank you all for allowing this hybrid format. And then now for allowing us to see all the wonderful people that came out in the snow and in the cold to come be a part of this conversation. So I definitely just want to thank you all and give a shout out to my friend Curry, who I see a few seats in the front, who has an amazing body of work at the show as well.
You have a question? There's one more question. Hold on.
Sorry to keep everyone here. I just had a question that kind of I'm really interested in the way that architecture and design and arts are able to kind of coalesce and come together, and how people are able to do that in both like a contemporary, modern sort of way. And I'm also like really interested in the spirituality behind a lot of the architecture that was coming out of African cities pre-colonization, post-colonization, during colonization, also in the Caribbean and what was going on in America. So I kind of am wondering if this is a question to both of you, if you kind of think about the connectedness of nature and architecture and space when you're designing a structure as an architect, Germane, and then in your art practice. And how that could affect how you go about making something, or how you go about researching archives, just kind of in general, I guess.
Yeah, the stuff that I personally believe that like architecture only exists within the landscape, within the earth, within the soil. So in that way, we don't know how to detach them in our studio. We don't know how to talk about things without talking about materials, and materials are extracted from somewhere. They're extracted from something. I didn't show the most recent thing we did in Chicago, which is a series of columns that were made out of various earthly materials like soil, clay, marble, limestone, things of that nature. We're always experimenting with materiality because so much about architecture is rooted in materiality, in my opinion. And we also try to make sure that the things that we make have a certain permanence, because this idea of designing for 100 years or designing for permanence, we don't believe that in the studio. Certain things have life cycle costs. And for us, the life cycle is the actual material deterioration itself. So I think that's why we're able to do more nimble things, because we're operating in this really interesting space between permanence and impermanence of materials.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a practicing architect, but I can maybe just share some of the experiences and the ways that I think about some of the things that you posed in your question. I'll start by saying it made me think a lot about, because when you touched on spirituality and materiality, when I was in 7th grade, our teacher had us build an indigenous structure on well, like I said, all of Saint Croix is a former plantation, but it was in the botanical gardens, which is also on a former plantation. And that process of having to go in the bush, cut with a machete, to go find, vines and bring them together. And as a class, we had to figure it out. He didn't give us much guidance. We had to figure it out on our own. We were about 13. that was an amazing experience, and it made us think a lot about, we live in a place which is a hurricane zone. These structures do not withstand hurricanes. And so much of our response to climate change is about like making more, structures that are going to last and withstand. And I just thought about these people who, for hundreds, thousands of years, that was not what their concern was, right? It was very much using the materials, and of course they would blow down. And you kind of, so I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about. I thought about that when you said that. I thought about like what that means. I think Germane responded so beautifully, that tension between permanence and impermanence. But I also think a lot about the hauntings that are in the spaces that are still there. Like when I worked in my building, my studio, and I would be like sanding and caulking and scraping and painting, and I realized like I was breathing the dust of their shedded skin. Like it really was like, whoa, this, like I'm living in their remnants, literally. And I am very aware of that, being a steward of structures that are hundreds of years old. I'm very aware of their presence, both spiritually, but also in the materials in their hand, the way that they shape them. And I think that's something that I think about deeply in my practice when I am commissioned to do new things or go to different spaces. I'm always very aware that that presence can be felt in the materials.
Would you guys be open to a couple of Zoom questions?
Sure.
Yeah. All right. This is from Michelle Wilkinson. Thank you both.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Michelle. I am thinking about the chairs behind Germane and Vaughn's structures are in conversation at different scales and across time. Curious if you each have reflections on each other's work.
Is that for me to go first?
Yeah,
I think
you go
it's
first.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's up to you.
Yeah. My biggest reflection is how so much of it is similar, and that the themes of home, ornament, archiving, and the diaspora is present in Vaughn's work. What I love most about those three structures in front of the museum is that they're familiar, but that they're also unfamiliar. Like you see the silhouette of the home and it makes sense. But then you wonder what's cladding the outside of it, what's the material, how is it aggregated, where's the transparency, where's the porosity? And there's all this stuff that happens within the structure that then makes it extremely complex, even though some of the smaller individual components are things that are pretty innocuous considering where it's found in its original location there in the island. So I was super interested in her ability to translate something that might be perceived in the natural environment as something familiar, but then abstract that into something that's extremely complex. Plus, those things are just really pretty. Like they're gorgeous. So
thank you. I had sent Germane a note yesterday telling him, I was so fascinated by this. I did some research. I'm very like research based. I was like researching him a bit and some of his other talks. And one of the things that I was really fascinated by was your interest in authorship in architecture, like how community or like even my project, it's my name associated with it, but it's like a whole team of people whose design influence, whose mentorship, whose inspiration, that they're all a part of the piece as well. And I thought I was really interested in your ideas around architecture, especially maybe in response to the things that we think are European, that maybe have all these indigenous or African influences, and rethinking the concept of authorship in architecture. And maybe you want to say more about that. I find that really interesting.
Oh, just to put it simply, it's like I don't make all this shit by myself. Like I'm just like, that idea that is like the single genius that like sketches everything. It's like it's not true for us. So I feel like I don't lose anything by giving other people credit. And I don't lose anything by saying this was done in collaboration with or with the assistance of. I don't believe in erasing the names of the people that helped build our stuff. Like if somebody asks me how long did it take you to build it, I'm like, I don't know, I didn't build it. Like we drew the stuff, but we didn't build this thing. And so some things we do build, some things we don't. But I don't think we lose anything by saying that we share credit when it's necessary and when people do stuff. I think all this stuff comes back around karmically. So we just try to do the best that we can.
And I think it's also interesting, like, unfortunately, I didn't get to listen to the piece at the Cooper Hewitt, so I definitely want to do that while I'm still here. But I think it's also visible in even your approach, like the ways that even the homage that you give to your grandmother and to your family, and like that's also for me another way of thinking through a more complex sense of authorship. Like you're not just yourself. You're not just Germane. You're like, I'm Germane, but I'm also my grandmother. I'm also my auntie. I'm also my this. I'm also my that. Like, I find that that's how you seem to approach your practice as well. Like, it's like realizing I'm not just this. It's like there's a whole community, and it's about how do we create that archive and center that collectivity. That's what it feels like your practice is also dealing with.
Oh, for sure. And I'm the youngest sibling. So if I didn't give my older siblings credit, I'd have hell when I get home to Chicago. So part of this is not wanting to get beat up by my older sisters.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe a round of applause for.
Thank you.